Have you ever wondered if God himself ever broke the Ten Commandments? A provocative question, isn't it? Now before we dive deep, let's set the stage by discussing the Ten Commandments. These are a set of biblical principles relating to ethics and worship, which play a fundamental role in Judaism and Christianity. They lay out the basic rules of behavior for humanity, ranging from prohibitions against murder and theft to commands to honor one's parents and keep the Sabbath holy. These commandments are often seen as absolute, unbreakable laws, universal in their application. They're like the bedrock of morality, providing a framework for ethical living. But what if we were to examine these commandments from a different perspective? What if we turned the lens towards God himself? It's a fascinating and thought-provoking perspective, isn't it? Now let's explore some instances where God may have broken his own commandments. Let's start with the sixth commandment. Thou shalt not kill. Now we're all familiar with the story of Noah and the ark, right? A tale of divine wrath and mercy, where God, displeased with the wickedness of humanity, decides to cleanse the earth with a great deluge. Only Noah, his family, and a pair of every animal species are spared, safeguarded in a massive ark built under divine instructions. But let's think about this for a moment. The Great Flood, as it's often called, wasn't just a heavy rain that lasted for 40 days and 40 nights. It was a cataclysmic event that wiped out almost all of humanity. The Bible doesn't give us an exact number, but if we consider the population growth rates and the timeline, we are talking about billions of lives extinguished in one fell swoop. Now the commandment clearly states, "Thou shalt not kill." But in the case of the Great Flood, it's hard to see this as anything but mass extermination. It's not a pleasant thought, but it's one that's worth mulling over. Of course, one could argue that this was divine justice, not murder. After all, God was punishing humanity for its wickedness, right? But then, we must ask ourselves, is killing on such a massive scale justifiable no matter the reason? And if God, who gave the commandment, can break it, what does it say about its absoluteness? These are difficult questions, and they don't have easy answers. But it's worth noting that in the narrative of the Great Flood, God himself expresses regret for the destruction he caused. He makes a covenant with Noah, promising never to destroy all life on earth with a flood again. This remorse and promise could be seen as an acknowledgement of the harshness of his actions. That was a heavy example, but the list doesn't end here. Moving on to the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet. In this context, to covet means to yearn to possess or have something. So, how does this relate to the divine? Well, let's delve into the fascinating concept of worship. Worship, in many religions, is a way to show reverence and adoration for a deity or deities. But could this desire for worship and followers be interpreted as a form of coveting? Imagine if a person desired the affection and attention of others to the point that they would do anything to get it. We'd probably call this behavior obsessive or greedy, wouldn't we? Now let's apply this same logic to God. He desires the worship of the entire human race, billions of people, and not just their worship, but also their love, their obedience, their attention. He desires to be the focal point of their lives, their ultimate concern. In the Bible, the Israelites were told to worship only God, to make no idols, to place him above all else. This is not a mere request for respect or acknowledgement, but a demand for exclusive devotion. This certainly seems like a covetous desire, yet isn't it interesting how we often view these divine desires differently? When humans covet, it's seen as a flaw, a sign of greed. But when God covets the worship and adoration of humans, it's seen as a rightful demand. Is this because we hold God to a different standard, or because we interpret the commandment in a limited human-centric way? What if we viewed the 10th commandment from a broader perspective? What if coveting was not just about human desires but also divine desires? If we were to do this, then could we not argue that God, in his desire for worship and followers, is breaking the 10th commandment? Interesting, isn't it? But there's more to this. Now, let's look at the first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. A straightforward command, isn't it? But what if we told you that the very entity that issued this commandment exhibits behaviors that could be interpreted as breaking it? Let's delve into some instances in religious texts where God displays signs of jealousy. In the book of Exodus, God declares, "For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." Now, jealousy is typically an emotion experienced when one perceives a threat to something they value. Can we infer then that God felt threatened by the existence or worship of other gods? If so, this suggests that God acknowledges the presence of other gods, which contradicts the very essence of the first commandment. In another instance, we see God commanding the Israelites to destroy the altars and idols of other gods in Deuteronomy. This action again implies recognition and acknowledgement of other gods. This is not to say that God is worshiping other gods, but the act of acknowledging them could be seen as a breach of the First Commandment. In the book of Judges, God expresses his anger towards the Israelites for worshiping other gods and says he will no longer save them. This reaction can be seen as another manifestation of jealousy, reinforcing the idea that God perceives a threat from other gods. It's important to remember that these interpretations are subjective. These instances are not meant to accuse or undermine, but to encourage thought and discussion. The very essence of religious texts is to explore, question, and understand. These examples, however, do raise an interesting question. Can God break his own commandments? And if so, what does this mean for us as humans, who are expected to live by these rules? So, even the First Commandment isn't immune to this discussion. Now that we've seen these instances, what does it all mean? Let's delve into it. These instances pose important questions about the nature of the divine and the complexities buried within religious texts. They reveal a side of the divine that is not often discussed, one that is nuanced and layered. These instances, far from undermining religious beliefs, actually enrich our understanding of them. Consider the Great Flood. It's a narrative that has been passed down through generations, often told as a tale of divine justice. But when scrutinized through the lens of the commandments, it presents a different picture. The act of wiping out billions of lives can be perceived as a contradiction to the sacred commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." This raises questions about the divine's decisions, pushing us to consider the complexities of divine justice. Then there's the desire for worship, an aspect that's often associated with human traits like vanity and pride, but when seen in the context of the divine, it becomes a paradox. If the divine is all-knowing and all-powerful, why does it desire worship? This contradiction opens up a new perspective on the nature of the divine and its relationship with humanity. The First Commandment, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," further complicates this picture. It suggests a divine entity that demands loyalty and exclusivity. But why? Is it a show of divine authority or a reflection of divine insecurity? These instances, while seemingly contradictory, provide a more nuanced view of God and religion. They invite us to question, to probe, and to understand the divine in all its complexity. They don't necessarily challenge faith, but rather they deepen it, adding layers of understanding to our perception of the divine. In the end, these contradictions remind us that religion, like anything else, isn't black and white. It's filled with shades of gray, with complexities and contradictions that make it all the more intriguing. So, it seems, even the divine isn't free from contradictions. In conclusion, the picture we get is far from simple. We've traced a pattern of divine actions that, on the surface, seem to contradict the very commandments set forth. From the catastrophic events of the Great Flood to the insatiable desire for worship, there is an undeniable complexity to this narrative. We've explored how the First Commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me," could be seen as indicative of a divine desire for exclusivity, a form of spiritual monopoly. Yet, as we've discussed, these instances might not be as straightforward as they seem. Instead of a black and white narrative, we're left with a rich tapestry of paradoxes. A testament to the complexity inherent in discussions about divinity and religion. The contradictions don't necessarily negate the commandments, but rather, they add layers of depth and nuance. Perhaps then, the question isn't whether God broke his commandments, but what these instances tell us about the nature of divinity and religion itself.